The Soviet Union had the chance to build its own Tiger, and WWII surpassed the Germans in this. It is about the heavy tank, KV-3WWII. Why was it never put into mass production? What happened to the only prototype? I will talk about all of this in my video. On December 17, 1939, having been created just over 3 months earlier, the KV prototype tank received its combat debut during the breakthrough of the line, Monarchheim, Panchayat. It turned out to be so successful that just 2 days later, it was adopted into service. The preparation for its mass production began almost immediately. And from August 1940, it began to be delivered to the troops in 2 modifications. These are the KV-1 and KV-2. Despite its outstanding combat qualities, from the very beginning of its operation, it became clear that the tank was still raw and required serious refinement. The main drawbacks were the low reliability of the transmission and engine overheating, which did not allow prolonged driving at high gears, which reduced the average travel speed. There were also complaints about insufficient visibility. Nevertheless, it continued to be produced unchanged for more than 2 years. A total of 3,267 tanks were produced. Only in the summer of '42, after numerous complaints from the front, did they begin its modernization. The KV-1 received new components. The gearbox, main clutch, final drives, improved cooling system, and commander's cupola. Item. They completed the entire scope of work in just 3 months. But why wasn't the third version of such a successful project developed and put into mass production? Actually, they did make it, and quite extensively, but let's go through everything in order. Perhaps it's worth starting with the first German heavy tank. The vehicles are newly built. Only 5 prototypes were made, 2 of which were constructed from non-armored steel. The Wehrmacht rejected it, but for Goebbels' propagandists, it became a genuine gift. Calling a 23-ton vehicle, with up to 20 millimeters of bulletproof armor, a heavy tank is ridiculous. But thanks to its impressive dimensions, length 6.6, width 2.2, and height 2.98 meters, with 2 guns of 75 and 37 millimeters and 3 machine guns, it looked sufficiently intimidating and was quite suitable for an advertising campaign. They promoted him to the fullest extent. Photos appeared in all European newspapers and magazines. Documentary films were made about him. His characteristics were, of course, slightly exaggerated without any qualms. The peak of his popularity came at the beginning of World War II. In April 1940, 3 full-scale tanks were sent to Norway. They did not take part in battles, but marched along familiar routes on the street of the camouflaged donkey. The propagandists did their job professionally, managing to film the 3 tanks from carefully selected angles, creating the impression of an armada of indestructible machines. The whole world saw the photographs and newsreel footage. The trick succeeded 100%. The English believed that Rick was producing them by the hundreds. Moreover, the German technical data, TTX, was deliberately calculated as inferior. They also managed to deceive the leadership of the Soviet Union. The tank, inflated by propaganda, was included in the identification guide of fascist tank types, under the name Rheinmetall, as the primary German heavy tank with armor, comparable to the KV-1. And with this data came subsequent manuals, training guides, and posters. They even issued a stamp featuring its image. But the main event happened a little earlier. Just a couple of months after its parade in Wosla, in mid-June 1940, which has not yet been fully mass-produced, a joint decree by the SNK and the Central Committee is issued, directing the Kirov factory to build 2 KV tanks with 90mm armor, and 2 with 100mm armor, each pair equipped with different armaments, 76mm with F-32 gun, and 85mm with F-30 gun. And the new KV tank modification, with even stronger armor and armament, was immediately planned. After the start of serial production of the first 2, a joint resolution of the NSK and the Central Committee began work on this topic, issued in mid-June. By that time, about a dozen KV-1s and only 4 KV-2s had been built. The deadlines were missed slightly, but instead of 4 tanks, only 2 were built. On November 5th, the first was delivered with a 76mm gun and 90mm armor. On December 5th, the second was delivered with an 85mm gun and 100mm armor. The tanks were designated as KV-150 or Object 150 and KV-220, or the Object 220, respectively. Testing of the prototypes began in January. The Ko-150 was essentially a production tank with externally increased armor plates 15 mm thick. They never changed the geometry of the hull and turret. Even the smallest components and assemblies remained unchanged. The external model can only be distinguished by the commander's cupola that appeared on the turret. The weight increased from 47 to 51 tons. Therefore, the 600 horsepower V2K diesel engine was boosted to 700 horsepower. On the testing ground, the tank managed to travel 200 kilometers before it was withdrawn from trials. The boosted engine refused to work. It only had power in second gear. At higher gears, it overheated. This happened despite the test being conducted in winter, with temperatures below 10 degrees. A decision was made to upgrade the engine's cooling systems. For the KV-220 with F-30 guns, a new box-shaped turret was developed, resembling the KV-2 turret. With the mass increased to 63 tons, the tracks were lengthened by one road wheel, resulting in 7 wheels per side. The tank was also fitted with experimental V5 engines with a power of 700 horsepower. The tests ended before they properly started. The engine failed already on the second day. However, it was determined that firing on the move was impossible, and the F-30 gun was unbalanced. Both tanks, by and large, failed the tests. However, the KV-150 clearly appeared closer to completion, and on March 15th, a decree was issued instructing the Kirov plant to begin mass production, under the designation KV-3 and with a slightly different specification, a 76mm F-34 gun and a V5 engine. Moreover, in the plans for 1941, it was given priority with 600 units, the same number as the other KVS. Around the same time, the High Command received intelligence reports. Later, it turned out that they were not entirely reliable. Reports indicate that heavily armored heavy tanks are already being produced and entering service in the Reich, vying up to 90 tons, with thick armor and guns up to 90mm in caliber. Accordingly, an adequate response was needed because the existing KV tanks could not counter them. A new decree comes into force in April. In addition to the directive to begin designing the super heavy monsters, KV-4 and KV-5, it significantly increased the requirements for the KV-3 tank. The armor thickness was raised to 120 millimeters, with the turret walls inclined at no less than 30 degrees. And the turret itself had to be stamped. It was decided to arm the KV-3 with a 107mm caliber anti-tank gun. The deadlines were quite tight: 8 days for the hull and turret drawings, 10 days for the prototype, and by May 20th, the turret hull had to be provided in metal. By the 30th, install the turret and the gun. The plans for producing the KV-3 in 1941 were not changed, i.e., 500 units, but already modified according to the new requirements in design. The first 50 were expected already in August. It was already impossible to further develop the KV-150, which became the KV-3, to fit these parameters. It was renamed KV-6, and the KV-3, given the project name Object 223, began developing for interchangeability with KV-220 or Object 220. To shorten the deadlines, they decided to test the new component assemblies on the existing KV-220. They replaced the broken engine on it, loaded it to a calculated weight of 70 tons, and by April 20th already began field tests. In May, the State Commission was presented with the technical project and a wooden model of the tank. The tank received a modified KV-220 hull and a completely new turret in a conical shape, with a widened turret ring and a small bulge for the commander's turret placement. It was planned to install a diesel engine, the V2SN, with supercharging, producing 850 horsepower and a new gearbox. After addressing some comments submitted for review, they proceeded to manufacture the prototype. If the artillerymen met their development deadlines, the tank crews began to encounter problems. By May 20th, they had failed to produce both the turret and the stamps for it. They could be ready no earlier than a month later. By that time, the loaded KV-220 had already covered 1,330 kilometers on the test range. As expected, the KV-1 components could not handle such weight. The gearbox gears shifted with difficulty, the balancing rollers bent, and the torsion bars broke. The engine, for the 70-ton vehicle also turned out to be clearly underpowered. Since chassis number 3 was not yet ready, on May 20, they decided to thoroughly repair the existing ones. Within 10 days, a V2SN engine, an upgraded suspension, and running gear components were installed into the hull. After repairs, the tank was returned to the proving ground. Before the war began, it had run an additional 655 kilometers and was hardly breaking down anymore. Regarding the KV-3, the chassis was fully assembled without the turret. On June 26, the 4th day of the war, work was halted. The Kirov plant no longer focused on advanced tanks. All resources were dedicated to increasing KV-1 production. When the evacuation began in October, all 3 vehicles, KV-100, 50, Q-120, and KV-3, were handed over to the troops and sent to the front. Since the KV-3 was turretless, and the KV-220's F-30 gun was operational in its turret, they were fitted with a serial KV-1 turret, and practically nothing is known about their further fate. Well, at least I couldn't find anything. There is only information from the tanks for the motherland. These are the KV-220, or KV-3, whose turret was blown off by a 150 medium howitzer shell, killing the entire crew. They only returned to the KV-3 project at the beginning of 1942, when evacuation problems were resolved. This time, they plan to install a new diesel engine with a power of 1200 horsepower on the tank. However, by spring, work was stopped again, this time permanently. The Germans did not have super heavy tanks, but they were quite successful in fighting against the KV-3 and KV-4 tanks, something like with the T-34 and KV-1. The GB2 decided that the KV-3 was not needed. There simply was no worthy opponent for it. Moreover, the production of guns here was resumed in August 1941, since there was nothing to mount them on, and serial production of the tank had not yet begun. Most likely, they regretted this in 1943, when the Germans had a large number of new Tigers and Panthers. Up to the T-44, they were equipped with 75mm barrel guns, which could penetrate the KV-1 and T-34, but the KV-3's armor could theoretically withstand them. The KV-3 was not only functional, but proved to be more powerful than the Tiger, and could become its worthy opponent. With approximately equal armor and gun penetration, the KV-3 had heavier armor. The thickness of the sloped armor plates was 130mm on the front, and 90mm on the sides of the hull, 170mm front, and 150mm side armor of the turret. The Tiger is much more modest, with vertical plates 100mm thick at the front, and 90mm thick on the sides of the hull and turret. The KV-3 was, of course, 11 tons heavier, 68 versus 57 tons. But thanks to the more powerful engine of the KV-3, 850 horsepower versus 700, their specific power was comparable, 12.5 and 12.9 horsepower per ton, respectively. If it had received the planned 12,200 horsepower engine, it would have advanced significantly. That would be 17.6 horsepower per ton.eu. No German tank had that until the end of the war. The KV-3 was a bit slower, 30 kilometers per hour compared to 38, and had a longer and narrower hull, 0.3 meters narrower and 1.5 meters longer. It was less maneuverable, but had lower ground pressure, 0.93 kilograms per square centimeter, compared to 1 and 0.3. It could climb a steeper slope, 37 degrees versus 35, and a higher wall, 1.2 meters versus 0.79, a wider ditch and a deeper ford. Overall, it was quite a promising and can be considered a successful project of Soviet tank design. Unfortunately, the planned features were not realized. In the first half of the war, it simply had no equal. What do you think? Did the KV-3 have potential, or was it an unnecessary vehicle? Write your questions in the comments and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my new videos. You know best who to send this video to. Bye.